Dear students, welcome to massive open online course on research methodology in history. Today we shall be discussing about the Marxist phase. The Marxist theory of history was derived from the political thought and philosophy of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It had a significant impact on history writing in the 20th century, even though it had to operate outside the boundaries of conventional academia for a relatively long time. Marxism was a theory of knowledge and a call for revolutionary actions, and this was reflected in the way it was conceived as an instrument of change, through highlighting how historically the ruling class had oppressed the working people. Thus, it diverged from historical orthodoxy of the late 19th and early 20th century by being non-neutral and having a very clear agenda. So, what is Marxist theory of history? There are no single text of Marx or Engels that laid out the tenets of the Marxist theory of history. Rather, it was derived from a collection of texts and writings like the German Ideology, the Communist Manifesto, the Preface to the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Origins of Family, Private Property and State and Socialism, Scientific and Utopian. This theory, of which has also been referred to as a materialist conception of history, has a range of features. First, production is the defining feature of human civilization and all human societies. Production happens through the forces of production and social relations surrounding productions constitute the social system. Each society has its own characteristics, there being both cooperation and exploitation. Different forms of society has different ways of extracting surplus. The second feature, the social relation of production create different classes, which can be expressed simply as the exploiter and the exploited. The relations between these two classes is always antagonistic and was termed as class struggle. In capitalism, the classes and the differences between them is thought to be the most distinct. Now, Marx argued that either the laws of economic development would automatically cause the decline of capitalism, or the class struggle would result in a revolution that would overthrow the capitalist order. The Marxist theory of history proposes a tiered model of society. The economic sector or production and its relations make up the base on which stands the superstructure, consisting of legal, political, and cultural institutions. Marx thought that the irrational, unlimited greed and expansion of the capitalist system would cause its own overthrow. Its excesses would give rise to massive opposition, thus uniting the working class in agitation, and this would ultimately cause the revolution and the overthrow of capitalism. Now, we shall be looking at the different phases of Marxist historiography. We'll start with Kautsky. So the first half of our discussion would be from Kautsky to Stalin. From 1889 to 1914, Marxist scholars tried to piece together a coherent Marxist idea of history, as the idea was scattered all over Marx's own writing. It was hoped that this would help the development of socialist movement in Europe. Engels started the process from late 1870s, and he saw Marxism as a scientific theory that had discovered the laws of development of human history. He played a large role in developing a coherent theoretical structure for Marxism. From this phase to First World War, there were numerous attempts trying to get Marxism to be compatible with the theoretical developments and discoveries of the natural sciences. Scholars like Kautsky and Plekhanov played a very important role in this initiative. In fact, it can be argued that after Engels died, Karl Kautsky was the foremost Marxist thinker. He edited a Marxist journal called The New Era and was the author of numerous books on Marxism, including The Materialist Conception of History, published in 1927. He saw history in structural and causal terms. His histories of Christianity and the Reformation were remarkable for their sophistication. His historical views were also strongly influenced by his Darwinian ideas. Thus, to him, there were strong ties of continuity. He argued that three urges were common to animal and humans: self-preservation, reproduction, and maintenance of their society or group. Now, he went on to argue that it was conflict, whether intra-species or with the environment, that actually drove environmental change. Another notable Marxist historian of the time was Georgy Plekhanov. He played a huge role in the development of Marxist theory, especially in Russia. He argued that it was the environment and geographical factors that shaped the economic base. However, he also argued that with the development of productive forces, eventually human beings gained the ability to dominate the environment. From this point, it was the laws of social development and not natural laws that governed human history. He also argued that all human beings, even genius or extremely talented people, are shaped by the historical forces and have little individual agency. Another important scholar of this period was Nikolai Bukharin. He was one of the chief communist leader of Soviet Communist Party. His manual on the Marxist view of history, The Theory of Historical Materialism, remained the official party manual till 1938. Now, his view was strictly deterministic. He argued that all events, natural or social, could be investigated in the same way. He also denied the existence of accidents, chance or luck, linking everything in complex causal chains. Now we shall be looking at the Western Marxism and the influence of humanism. Marxism, outside the fear of communist rule, started to diverge from 1920s onwards. This was evident in the classical book History and Class Consciousness by Lukács, published in 1923. The changes that were apparent drew sharp criticism from orthodox Marxists who argued that in Western Marxism there was total neglect of the theories of Engels, that there was too much emphasis on the superstructural objects like art, literature, and that non-Marxist intellectuals' influence like Spinoza, Hegel, Kant, Freud, and so on was very prominent. However, in the face of this criticism, it needs to be noted that with Marxism in Soviet Union becoming nothing more than narrow regurgitation of Stalinist viewpoints, it was the innovative approaches of Western Marxists that kept it alive and relevant. While their initiative in imbuing superstructural elements like philosophy and culture with a determining role was a decisive break with the orthodoxy, it did enable them to theorize their approach in a far more sophisticated manner than orthodox Marxists. Thus, if we are to assess Western Marxists, they had certain features. What are the features? 1. The most common connecting feature was the belief in the idea of human agency, specifically collective human agency. Second, they emphasized on phenomena and on ethical foundations of Marxist theory. Third, they rejected the rigid and deterministic approach that saw Marxist interpretation of history as analogous to scientific law and emphasized the primacy of class consciousness, subjectivity, and individual experience. They argued, the next point is that they argued that historical change occurs not due to universal laws, but due to human consciousness and actions. And finally, human beings, their culture and consciousness are also determinants of the mode of production as the economic forces. Now we shall be discussing about structural Marxism. What is structural Marxism? Structural Marxism developed in the 1960s and 1970s through the efforts of scholars like Althusser. Althusser sought to reinterpret Marxism and differentiate it from both orthodox and humanistic Western groups. He argued that Marx's writings should be divided into 3 phases. The early phase, the works of the break, when Marx was breaking from his early influence and trying to formulate his own theory, and finally the mature phase. He argued that the works of the early phase should not be considered as they were full of pre-Marxist influences. Even in the mature phase, what Althusser considered to be true Marxism was relatively scarce and had to be teased out through theoretically complex reading strategies. Althusser came to various conclusions. First, He argued that Marxism was anti-humanist and anti-historicist. Marxism did not explain historical change in terms of human needs, that it should not be considered a human science but a natural science. Second, he considered society to be a decentered, non-deterministic structure, devoid of human agency. And finally, history was a process without subject or goals. There are no progressive stages of change, and the human subjects are not autonomous but entirely constituted by socio-economic and political forces. So far, we have discussed about Western Marxism. Now we shall be looking at some of the notable Western Marxist historians. George Lefebvre. Lefebvre was one of the most eminent historians of French Revolution. He argued that bourgeoisie came to power after the revolution, after having destroyed the system created by the church, the aristocracy, and the monarchy. This emergence of the bourgeoisie led to the rise of capitalism as ideas like private property and equality before law gained currency. His first book, The Peasant of the Nord region, during the French Revolution, focused on the daily lives of peasantry, which was a thoroughly overlooked theme in history. He argued that while peasants supported removal of feudal power, they wished to retain the communal rights they had traditionally enjoyed. Now, these peasants had not benefited from the land distribution during the French Revolution, but believed that eventually everyone would get some amount of property. Lefebvre was also connected to Lucien Febvre and Marc Bloch of the Annales school, and his book, The Great Fear, was influenced by the Annales viewpoint and methods. This book would in turn go on to influence the history of mentalities, which would be an Annales specialty. Two of his books, The Coming of the French Revolution in 1951 and The French Revolution in 1951, established him as one of the principal historians of the revolution. To him, the revolution was a breaking point in history between a hierarchical feudal society and a bourgeois society based on individuality and legal equality. His analysis of the peasant revolts and how they differed from the French Revolution was quite influential. He argued that while feudalism was indeed abolished, the proliferation of landholdings and the tying down of laborers to the land caused a lack of surplus for investment into agricultural capitalism. Next, we shall be discussing about E.J. Hobsbawm. Hobsbawm was one of the greatest Marxist historians. His work encompassed a wide range of issues from peasants and workers to culture to outlaws. He made some remarkable contribution to labor history. Rejecting institutional labor history, he wrote this history as the history of the working class people. He pointed out the intelligent agitational methods of Luddites. He showed how industrialization did not automatically lead to an improvement in the living condition of the people, and he proved that the top echelon of the labor movement actually hindered labor radicalism in his theory of labor aristocracy. His book, Laboring Men and Worlds of Labor, are specially remarkable in this regard. In Primitive Rebels, Captain Swing and Bandits, he studied the movements and agitations of pre-industrial rural people and outlaws. He argued that social bandits were seen as heroes and champions of the poor in rural society. He was a prolific historian of modern capitalism. In books like Industry and Empire, Age of Revolution, Age of Capital, and Age of Empire, he treated capitalism as a world historical phenomena. He argued that technological innovation had just as much to do with constituting the modern world as class conflict. Another important Marxist historian was E.P. Thompson. E.P. Thompson was one of the most prominent and influential social historians. He wrote pioneering histories of labor, 18th century England and forest laws. Ignoring the deterministic tendencies to Stalinist history, he put a lot emphasis on consciousness and agency of the common people. He was in favor of reformulating the base superstructure model and argued for these ideas in his famous book, The Making of the English Working Class, that popularized the new social history. This book was deeply influential in the way it redefined labor history, pioneered the approach of history from below, and contributed to the birth of cultural studies. He argued that by 1832, the English working class had been forged into a conscious group through decades of struggle, and that it was from this period that mature class consciousness in Marxist sense began to develop. He wrote about the 18th century in two path-breaking essays, Time, Work, Discipline and Industrial Capitalism, and The Moral Economy of the English Crowd in the 18th century. In the first essay, he argued about how the peasant and proto-industrial groups interacted with industrial capitalism, and in the second essay, he analyzed the nature of the moral economy of the English rural crowds and how this was fundamentally opposed to the political economy of capitalism, which was sacrificing traditional values and customs for profit. In his next book, Whigs and Hunters, he showcased rural protest against draconian forest acts that made the cutting of trees or hunting in the forest into capital offense. In his essay on the 18th century protests, Thompson argued that Gramscian concept of hegemony, where hegemony is condition where the ruling class has sufficient psychological control over the working class to prevent outright rebellion, and could be a useful tool to understand the nature of this protests. Thus, while there was a robust rural and working class culture, it could only spawn scattered riots, small protests, not full rebellions that could have overthrown the existing regime. Now we shall shift our attention to Indian Marxists. It is now necessary to briefly survey the beginning and the development of Marxist methods of historical scholarship in India. We'll start our discussion with Manabendranath Ray, followed by R.P. Dutt. Manabendranath Ray was the first Indian intellectual who tried to analyze colonial rule using Marxist methodology. In his book, India in Transition, he argued that British had destroyed Indian feudalism through a violent but necessary process. The Indian national leadership were bourgeois and had lost their progressive tendencies as they feared a mass upsurge. The peasants and working class were conscious enough to take charge of the national movement of their own. But thus, it was this class that the communists should ally with. He saw the revolt of 1857 as the last attempt by old feudal class to regain its power. He praised the social reformers but sharply criticized the Gandhian movements, which he saw as an attempt by reactionary forces to contain revolutionary forces already present in Indian nationalism. Next, R.P. Dutt. In his book, India Today, formulated the basic arguments of Marxist historiography in India. He argued that while the British rule had destroyed many elements of older system, it had not really given rise to new forces. He divided the colonial history of India into three phases. First, from 1757 to 1813 was the phase when merchant capital, where monopolistic trade of the company, plunder of wealth and military conquest to get more territories were the main feature. Second phase, from 1813 was the phase of industrial capitalism, which tried to establish a free market in India under British control. So, India could be flooded with British industrial goods, thus putting artisans and craftsmen out of work. And the final stage was the stage of financial capitalism, where financial bourgeois class of Britain dominated the bourgeoisie of India and dominated and distorted their development. Dutt also wrote about Indian nationalism, and he argued that bodies like Indian National Congress were attempts by Indian bourgeoisie to push back against this foreign domination. In the years preceding the First World War, the petty bourgeoisie were also making their presence felt, but it was not until the interwar years that the peasantry and the working class became active and united. The next historian was D.D. Kosambi. He caused a paradigm shift in Indian history. He rejected the religion-oriented periodization of history by James Mill and chronological dynastic history of Vincent Smith. He argued that true change in Indian history was better understood by phenomena like conversion of tribal lands to peasant cultivation. He prioritized material culture and modes of production over dynastic details. He argued that society is held together by bonds of production. However, he was an independent Marxist who saw Marxist theory as a method, and he did not feel bound to repeat the Marxist conclusions. He rejected Marxist theory of Asiatic mode of production and saw historical change in India through the lens of political economy. Thus, the rise of Buddhism could be explained through the rise of agriculture, artisanal production, and long-distance trade. He argued that the most fundamental transformation of Indian society was its conversion from a tribal society to a caste-divided society. He also equated caste with class. For Kosambi, the intellectual and cultural developments were direct reflection of economic changes. Thus, he saw religion as a tool of the state as well as a reflection of political economy of the time. For example, in the Gupta period, the Gita's tolerant and syncretic attitude was very important in the context of expanding rural settlements and flourishing trade. He saw the doctrine of bhakti in the Gita, which preached unquestioned obedience to God, translate into obedience to earthly rulers, a necessity for the powerful Gupta state. Now we shall be looking at some of the Marxist historians of the later period. Indian historiography has been greatly enriched by a number of Marxist historians. First, R.S. Sharma. To name a few, R.S. Sharma, he did pioneering work on Shudras and also on the political economy of early medieval India in his book on Indian feudalism. Another historian, Romila Thapar. She transformed the field of ancient Indian history through books like Ashoka and the Decline of the Mauryas, from lineage to state and cultural past. She has argued that Ashoka was not ahead of his time, but rather was quite representative of his time. His adoption of Buddhism and propagation of Dhamma were important for his attempt to consolidate the Mauryan Empire. In medieval Indian history, Irfan Habib, in his analysis of the Mughal economy in the agrarian system of Mughal India, has demonstrated that the fundamental contradiction of Mughal history was between the increasingly harsh revenue demands of the empire and the poor peasantry who were oppressed, exploited, impoverished, and ultimately driven to revolt. Furthermore, he has argued that methods of surplus exploitation and distribution in Mughal India had made capitalistic development unlikely. In modern Indian history, historians like A.K. Bagchi, Bipan Chandra, and Shobboshachi Bhattacharya have made notable contribution. Bipan Chandra has written at length on Indian nationalism and on the role of nationalist intelligentsia motivated by ideology, not by capital. In later works, he has applied the Gramscian perspective to study the national movement. Sumit Sarkar, another Marxist historian, he has written crucial and critical works on the Swadeshi movement and social trends in the 19th century Bengal. With this, we come to the conclusion of our discussion. The Marxist theory of history has been crucial both in the West and in India in formulating new paradigms of history and influencing generations of historians to write pioneering and critical works to better understand the past. Thank you.